Balmoral Castle was Queen Victoria's private refuge in the Scottish Highlands, but after the death of Prince Albert, it became connected with something far stranger. Behind closed doors, Victoria was said to have searched for messages from her dead husband, while John Brown, her trusted Highland servant, became linked to stories of trances, séances, and royal contact with the spirit world. Years after Brown's own death, a kilted figure believed to be him was reportedly still seen moving through Balmoral's corridors. So, did Victoria's attempts to remain close to Albert help create the ghost stories that still surround the castle today? Queen Victoria and Prince Albert first came to Balmoral in 1848, when they leased the estate as a private retreat in the Scottish Highlands. They soon decided the original house was too small for their growing family and royal household, so a new castle was built nearby. Completed in 1856, the pale granite building became one of the few places where Victoria and Albert could step away from the formal life of the court and live more quietly with their children. Balmoral was never simply another royal residence. Victoria loved the Highland landscape, the privacy of the estate, and the distance it gave her from London. Albert took a close interest in the design of the new castle and helped shape the daily life of the estate. Their time there revolved around family walks, riding, hunting, and evenings spent away from the pressure of public appearances. For Victoria, Balmoral became closely tied to the happiest years of her marriage. John Brown was already part of life on the estate during this period. Born near Balmoral, he entered royal service as a young man and assisted Albert during shooting and hunting trips. At that stage, Brown was one of many Highland servants working around the royal family, but he would later become far more important to Victoria than anyone could have expected. That change came after Albert died in December 1861. The place that had represented privacy and family happiness now held reminders of the husband Victoria had lost. Every room, pathway, and stretch of the estate carried some connection to their life together. Balmoral remained her refuge, but it also became one of the places where her grief was hardest to escape. During the years that followed, Victoria returned to the castle repeatedly. She preserved Albert's memory with extraordinary care and resisted pressure to return fully to public life. It was during this period that stories began to grow around her interest in messages from the dead, private spiritual meetings, and the growing presence of John Brown at her side. Not long after Prince Albert's death, the name of a teenage medium called Robert James Lees became linked with Queen Victoria's search for contact with her husband. Lees was only 13 when he was said to have entered a trance during a séance and spoken in a voice believed to be Prince Albert's. The message reportedly asked that Queen Victoria be told Albert wished to reach her. Two men connected with the royal household visited the young medium in disguise to test him. During the sitting, he was said to have addressed them by their real names and repeated private details connected with palace life. He was also credited with producing a message through automatic writing. The letter was supposedly signed with a private name used between Victoria and Albert, which convinced those around the Queen that the boy had received something genuine. The story became stranger during a later sitting. The voice said to be Albert's reportedly told Victoria that she no longer needed to rely on a professional medium. Instead, she should turn to the boy who used to hold my gun at Balmoral. The person believed to have been meant by that message was John Brown. He was already known to the royal household as a Highland servant, but his place beside the Queen would soon become far more personal. John Brown was no longer described simply as the man who helped Victoria through her grief. He became the man through whom she was said to hear Albert's voice again. As John Brown became more important to Queen Victoria, stories began to grow around what happened when the two were alone with a small circle of trusted people. It was claimed that he did far more than comfort the Queen. They suggested he became part of her private attempts to reach Prince Albert. According to those stories, Victoria would sit in darkened rooms where Albert's belongings had been carefully preserved. John Brown was then said to fall into a trance and speak in a voice that sounded different from his own. Instead of his usual Highland accent, the voice was described as softer and closer to Albert's German speech. The messages were said to offer comfort, but some went further, claiming the voice also advised Victoria on personal and royal matters. There is no surviving royal record that proves these sessions took place exactly as described, and much of the story comes from later spiritualist writing. Even so, the rumours persisted because Brown had become one of the few people Victoria trusted completely. To those around her, his influence was obvious. He remained close to the Queen, travelled with her, protected her privacy, and spoke to her with a freedom few servants would have dared. Their bond caused gossip across Britain, but the more unusual possibility was rarely discussed openly, that Victoria may have believed Brown helped her remain connected to Albert. When John Brown died in 1883, the loss struck her deeply. Victoria wrote of being deprived of someone she desperately needed, and although that could simply reflect grief for a close friend, later writers linked it to the alleged séances. In their version of events, Brown had not only been her companion, he had also been the final voice through which Albert could still reach her. After Queen Victoria's death, many private papers connected with John Brown were destroyed by members of the royal family. That has left gaps which later stories have been quick to fill. What remains certain is that Brown stood at the centre of Victoria's life for years, and that stories of trances, spirit messages, and secret meetings became tied to him long before his own ghost was said to appear at Balmoral. John Brown died on the 27th of March 1883, aged 56. Stories began to spread that he had not entirely left Balmoral behind. A man in Highland dress was said to appear inside the castle, moving quietly through the corridors and passing from view before anyone could properly approach him. The figure was usually described as a kilted servant rather than a grand royal apparition. He did not speak, threaten anyone, or create a dramatic scene. Witnesses simply became aware that someone was there, often at the edge of their vision, before the corridor was empty again. John Brown had spent so many years close to Queen Victoria, the figure was quickly identified as him. He had known the castle, its rooms, and its daily routines, and the ghost was said to behave as though he was still carrying out the same duties. Queen Victoria herself was later said to have felt John Brown's presence after his death. His loyalty in life made the idea of his return seem almost natural to those who already believed the bond between them had been unusually strong. Queen Elizabeth II was also said to have encountered or sensed the presence of a kilted man inside the castle. The figure is remembered in much the same way as the man himself, close to the Queen, protective of her privacy, and unwilling to leave his post. The strangest modern account connected to the royal estate comes from one of its older hunting lodges, where Queen Elizabeth II was said to rely on her corgis to warn her when something unseen was nearby. According to former royal butler Paul Borel, the Queen believed the old cottages around the estate carried an uneasy atmosphere. One lodge in particular was said to trouble her enough that she would not enter it alone. She preferred to take her dogs with her because, in her view, the dogs noticed a presence before she did. Paul claimed the animals would stop suddenly, stare into empty parts of the room, and begin to growl. Their bodies would stiffen, and the hair along their necks would rise as though someone unseen had entered. The Queen was said to watch the dogs closely, trusting their reaction more than anything she could see herself. The story is connected with one of the isolated lodges used by Queen Victoria and John Brown. Queen Elizabeth was reportedly unwilling to spend the night there because the atmosphere felt wrong and the dogs repeatedly behaved as though they were watching someone move through the room. For Elizabeth II, who had spent much of her life at Balmoral, the estate was familiar ground. Yet there were still rooms where she preferred not to be alone. In October 1876, the estate became the setting for one of the strangest royal Halloween celebrations ever recorded. As evening fell, Queen Victoria and Princess Beatrice joined a torchlit procession made up of estate workers, servants, and local tenants. The group moved through the dark grounds toward the castle, while the Queen's pipers played, turning the quiet estate into a scene of firelight, music, and moving shadows. A huge bonfire had been prepared. As the crowd gathered around it, a figure dressed as a witch appeared from the darkness, followed by people wearing grotesque masks and costumes. Some were dressed as demons or ogres, adding to the wild atmosphere of the night. The witch effigy was carried around the fire several times, while the crowd shouted and howled. It was then thrown into the flames as the celebration reached its height. What makes the event so striking is how completely Victoria embraced it. This was the same queen later remembered for black mourning clothes, strict ceremony, and a tightly controlled public image. Yet, at Balmoral, she joined a procession through the darkness and watched a witch burn in front of the castle. The celebration also shows why so many supernatural stories became attached to the castle. The estate stood in a part of the Highlands where old folklore and seasonal customs were still widely remembered and practiced. Victoria did not keep herself entirely separate from those beliefs and customs. She appeared comfortable, allowing the older traditions of the Highlands to become part of royal life. The bonfire eventually died down, the masked figures disappeared, and the royal household returned indoors. But the image remained. Balmoral glowing against the night, while a witch burned in the grounds below. Royal homes are often presented as places of ceremony, tradition, and continuity, but they are also private spaces where families have lived through grief, loyalty, and loss. Over time, those emotions become attached to particular rooms, corridors, and familiar routines, especially in a place that has remained closely connected to the same family for generations. That may be why the stories surrounding this Highland residence have lasted. They are not simply tales about seeing a figure or sensing something in an empty room. They reflect the belief that certain relationships were too important to end cleanly, and that some people remained tied to the place where they had once been trusted, loved, or needed. No one can now say with certainty what was seen, what was believed, or how much was added as the stories passed from one generation to the next. Yet the idea of the past lingering inside these walls has become part of the castle's identity. Perhaps that is the real reason the ghost stories endure. They allow history to feel less distant, reminding us that behind the titles and public appearances were people who mourned, remembered, and sometimes believed those they had lost were still close by.